Man has been flying aircraft for almost a century. But if the Wright brothers' epic first flight off Kill Devil Hill, North Carolina in 1903 is aviation's greatest milestone, then the development of the jet aircraft must surely be the next. The jet has brought revolutionary changes to the way we see the world. But, as so often with technological advances, the early impetus came from military demands. Jets were flying in combat before the end of the Second World War. Yet early types, like the Messerschmitt Me-262 and Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, could barely reach speeds of 550 miles per hour, well below that of sound. Today, high-speed combat jets routinely fly at well over twice the speed of sound. This extraordinary leap has put new demands on the pilot to react quickly in an ever-changing environment. Yet today's fast jet pilots are more than capable of rising to the challenge. Every aspect of flying has been transformed by the jet. Fastest of all is the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird spy plane, which can reach speeds in excess of 3 times that of sound. Others can climb into the skies at tens of thousands of feet a minute, almost as fast as a rocket, as they race to intercept potentially hostile aircraft. Some can fly at altitudes of up to 100,000 feet, the very edge of space. Other military jets literally hug the earth so that they can evade hostile air defenses. One futuristic breed, Stealth, is virtually undetectable by radar, enabling its crews to survive when the odds are stacked against them. At the other end of the spectrum are the massive military jet load carriers, like the Lockheed Galaxy. So huge is the Galaxy's interior that the Wright brothers could have comfortably made their first flights in it. It can transport 2 60-ton main battle tanks nearly 3,000 miles without refueling. The jet has brought similar spectacular changes to commercial aviation, so shrinking the world that nowhere is more than a day's flight away. "45 years ago, the first jet airliner, the British de Havilland Comet, could not reach across an ocean. It was the American Boeing 707 which really established long-range jet travel, with its ability to cross the Atlantic non-stop. The 707 is still in service after over 40 years of flying. The latest from the Boeing stable, the Boeing 777, can carry up to 450 passengers non-stop halfway around the world. An amazing achievement, which is often taken for granted. There is, however, one airliner that regularly flies at supersonic speeds and has been doing so for 25 years. Another example of the robustness of the jet aircraft. The Anglo-French Concorde can fly London to New York in little over 3 hours, enabling the busy executive to do the round trip, including having business meetings, in the space of a single day. Yet when the clouds of time are rolled back 60 years, this all seemed like an impossible dream to all but a handful of aviation enthusiasts. By the early 1930s, aircraft designers were beginning to realize that the piston-engined aircraft was reaching its limit. The propeller accelerates the air passing over the aircraft, and this gives it forward motion. The faster the propeller spins, the higher the air speed, but there is a limit to how fast it can rotate. Also, the higher the altitude, the less air the propeller has to work with. This imposes a height ceiling on piston-engined aircraft. Indeed, by 1945, the fastest piston-engined aircraft, the P-47 Thunderbolt, just exceeded 470 miles per hour and was limited to 40,000 feet. The jet engine, on the other hand, is not propeller dependent. It draws in cold air, which is compressed. This is then mixed with the fuel, ignited, and leaves the engine at high speed. The reactive force produced by these exhaust gases drives the aircraft through the air. Speed and height are limited largely by engine efficiency and aircraft shape. Among the first to realize this was Frank Whittle, a young British airman, who in the late 1920s was a cadet at the Royal Air Force Academy, Cranwell. Whittle wrote a paper on aircraft engines of the future and proposed rockets and gas turbines as possible means of propulsion. So convinced was he that a gas turbine could be adapted to power an aircraft that he took out a patent on his idea. In 1934, Whittle went to study engineering at Cambridge University. While there, he and a friend set up a company called Power Jets to develop a suitable aircraft jet engine. Not many in Britain were convinced, and during the next few years, always short of cash, Whittle would struggle to perfect a design. But unknown to him, a race was on, since the Germans too were interested in jets. The Junkers Aircraft Company began work to develop an engine. By mid-1939, this had been achieved, and the German Air Ministry ordered an airframe for it. Germany also had a brilliant young engineer called Hans-Joachim Pabst von Ohain, who took out a patent for a turbojet in 1935. Unlike Whittle, he was lucky enough to be taken under the wing of Dr. Ernst Heinkel and his aircraft company. As a result, on the 27th of August 1939, the world's first jet aircraft, the Heinkel HE-178, made a successful maiden flight. But 4 days later, Hitler's forces invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun, and the German Air Ministry, with more pressing matters on its hands, showed little interest in the Heinkel jet. Its development was therefore halted. Meanwhile, in Britain, Frank Whittle and his colleagues in Power Jets had got a testbed engine working. They had begun to design a flying version of it. The British Air Ministry was finally showing cautious interest, and eventually, in January 1940, a contract was placed with the Gloucester Aircraft Company to develop a suitable airframe for the Whittle engine. Frank Whittle could finally see light at the end of the tunnel. In Germany, Messerschmitt and Heinkel were developing a twin-engined airframe for the Junkers Umo gas turbine engine, and the Heinkel answer was the HE-280. This made its maiden flight on the 2nd of April 1941. Work to perfect the design continued for the next 2 years. But in March 1943, Dr. Heinkel was suddenly ordered by the Air Ministry to cease development. The solution put forward by his rival, Willy Messerschmitt, had been chosen instead. Back in Britain, the Gloucester Whittle was ready for its first flight in May 1941, a month after the Heinkel jet. It was symbolic that it should take place at Cranwell, where Whittle had first conceived the idea some 12 years before. Frank Whittle later recalled his sensations as the aircraft took off.
I was very tense, not so much because of any fears about the engine, but because this was a machine making its first flight. I'm told that shortly after takeoff, somebody slapped my back and said, "Frank, it flies," and that my curt response in the tension of the moment was, well, that's what it was bloody well designed to do, wasn't it?
Next to enter the jet race was the United States with the Bell P-59 Aerocomet. The maiden flight took place in October 1942, but conceived as a jet fighter, the Aerocomet proved to be an unsatisfactory gun platform and lacking in flight performance. Thus, it never got beyond the prototype stage. Meanwhile, the Germans had also been pursuing Whittle's other early idea for a new means of aircraft propulsion, rocket power. Indeed, the world's first rocket aircraft, the Heinkel HE-176, had flown at the end of June 1939. Heinkel did not pursue the concept, but Messerschmitt did. In April 1941, they unveiled the Me-163 Comet. This unique aircraft ran on two highly volatile fuels, hydrogen peroxide and a mixture of methyl alcohol and hydrazine hydrate. The two were mixed together and ignited, giving the aircraft immense power. The main drawback was that the fuel was expended so rapidly that once it had attained altitude, the Comet quickly became a mere high-speed glider. One of the main test pilots of the Comet was the remarkable Hanna Reitsch. She had first made her name in Germany as a glider pilot and was the holder of several records. She then qualified at the German Test Pilot School. Reitsch's gliding expertise was particularly valuable during the early trials of the Comet.
believe it, because Messerschmitt said...
Many years later, she looked back on the comet and recalled the thrill she had flying it.
It was not difficult to fly it. It was only an overwhelming impression. At the end of the airfield boundary, you already reached about 500 miles per hour, and with constant speed, you were climbing up in 1.5 to 2 minutes into a height of 30,000 feet. And I can only tell you, it was fascinating. It was like thundering through the skies, sitting on a cannonball. The landing was difficult because it was aerodynamical, so excellent that you had to take away the speed early enough for the landing and to touch the ground exactly at the threshold.
In the late summer of 1944, when the American bombers were appearing in force over Germany by day, the Comet finally entered service. It proved to be an effective interceptor, but its numbers were too few to make any significant impression. Of 370 comets built, only 40 survived the war, but its top speed of almost 600 miles per hour made it the fastest aircraft of its day. Japan also developed its own homegrown rocket plane, the Yokosuka Oka. In truth, it was actually a human-guided missile with a massive warhead in its nose. A bomber was used to develop the Oka to the target area. On arrival, it was released and glided towards its quarry. As the pilot closed, he switched on his rocket motor, dived steeply, and plunged into the carrier's deck, detonating the warhead. The Oka was but one of the many kamikaze, or suicide weapons, which the Japanese developed during the last and ever more desperate year of the war. The Germans too considered using a similar weapon, a piloted V-1 flying bomb. But by now, conventional jets were in combat service. Willy Messerschmitt's entry in the German jet competition first flew in July 1942, over a year after its Heinkel rival. Designated the Me-262, it was capable of reaching 540 miles per hour. However, the flight trials did not go smoothly. Furthermore, Messerschmitt was now tooling up to produce the piston-engined Me-209, a successor to the well-proven 109 fighter. In the spring of 1943, Adolf Galland, Germany's most renowned fighter pilot, tested the Me-262. He had first seen action during the Spanish Civil War and had led a fighter wing with great distinction during the Battle of Britain in summer 1940. In November 1941, at the age of 29, he had been appointed general in charge of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Galland was highly impressed by the 262 and recommended that it should go into immediate production, replacing the Me-209, which he said should be scrapped. But the German Air Ministry dithered over making such a drastic decision. Eventually, it was agreed that the Me-262 should enter production, but not in the quantities that Galland had demanded. A further delay occurred in 1943, when Hitler, concerned about the increasing threat of an Allied invasion in the West, demanded that the aircraft be built as a fighter bomber. As a result, it was not until July 1944, weeks after the Allies were firmly ashore in Normandy, that the Me-262 reached frontline squadrons. As a fighter, the 262 came as a rude shock to the air forces of the Western Allies, being much faster than any types which they had in service. But when coming into land, the pilot had to throttle right back, making it vulnerable to marauding Allied fighters. Galland, who had so championed the Me-262, was to have first-hand experience of flying it in combat. Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe's commander-in-chief, blamed Galland and his fighter pilots for the Allied bombers' ability to roam at will over Germany. Galland was sacked and ordered to form a special Me-262 squadron made up of some of Germany's leading fighter pilots. Galland's squadron fought with great distinction during the last months of the war in Europe. And afterwards he reflected on the advent of the combat jet.
But I think this was a unique situation. We had to our disposal the first operational jet, which superseded for at least 150 knots the fastest American and English fighters. It's a unique situation. This will only come if you have such a revolutionary change in technology like the jet has brought about.
The Germans got a second jet into service in 1944, the Arado 234 Blitz bomber. This was originally a private venture, but the Luftwaffe then took an interest, seeing it as an ideal high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. A bomber version was then built. This became operational in time for Hitler's counter-offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944. Finally, Heinkel came back into the jet field late in 1944 with their HE-162 Salamander, or People's Fighter. Although the subject of a top priority development program, none were to see combat service. The first British operational jet, the Gloucester Meteor, did not fly until March 1943, 10 months after its German Me-262 rival. Even so, the Meteor entered service at the same time as the Me-262, but was initially used in an entirely different role. The Meteor's first task was to help combat the waves of V-1 flying bombs which Hitler was launching against London. However, the early Meteor's top speed was only 410 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, barely fast enough to catch the V-1s. Nevertheless, it performed creditably in this role. The British also had a second jet, the de Havilland Vampire, with its twin-boom tail. Although a prototype flew in December 1943, it did not enter production before the war ended. After their disappointment over the performance of the Aerocomet, the Americans turned to the British de Havilland engine developed for the Vampire. In summer 1943, the Lockheed Aviation Company was tasked with designing an airframe for it. The job was given to the company's dynamic chief research engineer, Kelly Johnson, and a small team at Lockheed's plant at Burbank, California, now better known as the Skunk Works and the home of stealth technology. In record time, Johnson came up with the XP-80 Shooting Star, which first flew in January 1944. The aircraft exceeded 500 miles per hour, and so successful were the flight trials that a production order for 1,000 P-80s was placed that April. Although a few were sent to Europe, they arrived just too late to take any part in the war. The first jet had flown just before the outbreak of World War II. Yet it took 5 years for jets to see action. They did not meet one another in combat, and no one knew how air warfare would be effective when they did. There was, however, no doubt that jet propulsion represented the way ahead for aviation. When the Allies overran Germany in the spring of 1945, they captured an enormous amount of war booty. This included examples of every type of aircraft that had been in the Luftwaffe's armory. Among these aircraft were large numbers of jets, most of which had been grounded because of lack of fuel. Of especial interest was the Messerschmitt Me-262, which had made such an impression on the Allies during the last 9 months of the war. Detailed examination of this and other types revealed that the Junkers Jumo jet turbine engine was superior to those installed in Allied jets. Now that Germany had been vanquished, it was the British who initially led the way in the development of future jets. One of their prime objectives was to build an aircraft which could fly faster than sound, a speed of 750 miles per hour at sea level. At subsonic speed, the pressure waves surround the aircraft equally. As it closes to the speed of sound, the aircraft catches up with the pressure waves and becomes unstable. When it overtakes these waves, it is flying supersonic. A cone-like shock wave is formed, and the pressure waves are left well behind. The British de Havilland Company believed that the buffeting could be overcome by using swept-back wings. To prove this, they built the DH-108 research aircraft. They were convinced that it could fly supersonic, something no aircraft had done before. Geoffrey de Havilland, son of the company's founder and its chief test pilot, set out to achieve this. On the 27th of September 1946, he took off in the DH-108. As he flew full throttle up the Thames estuary, the aircraft suddenly broke up and the wreckage fell into the water, de Havilland losing his life. Clearly, more work needed to be done to evolve a proper supersonic aircraft. But in the aftermath of the World War, the British economy was going through a lean time. Industry was desperately short of money, and so the pursuit of supersonic speed was abandoned on cost grounds. Nevertheless, in September 1946, a Gloster Meteor 4 did raise the airspeed record to 616 miles per hour. The 2 RAF pilots involved were officially commended.
And now, I want to congratulate the 2 pilots, Group Captain Donaldson, thank you, sir, and Squadron Leader Waterton.
The British were also the first to tackle the question as to whether the jet could be used on aircraft carriers, with their short takeoff and landing distances. In December 1945, a de Havilland Sea Vampire, a variant of the second British military jet to enter service, achieved the first pure jet landing on an aircraft carrier, HMS Ocean. This confirmed that the jet represented the way forward in naval as well as land-based military aviation. Meanwhile, another British company, Saunders Roe, had applied the jet concept to naval aircraft in a novel way with the SR-A1 flying boat fighter. It did not get airborne until 1947, By then, the carrier jet was a reality, and so the project never got beyond prototype stage. More exciting was de Havilland's decision to design a jet airliner. Commercial aviation was getting back on its feet, especially in the United States, after the disruption caused by the war. New piston-engined airliners, like the Lockheed Constellation and the Boeing Stratocruiser, were coming into service. The Stratocruiser had a range of over 4,000 miles and could carry nearly 100 passengers, but its maximum speed was only 375 miles per hour. It was therefore logical that the jet engine should be used to speed up commercial aviation. It was this that de Havilland now pursued. Their jet airliner project eventually reached fruition in July 1949 with the unveiling of the DH-106 Comet, its 4 jet engines artistically molded into the wings. Capable of flying at a cruising speed of nearly 500 miles per hour, the Comet caused a stir throughout the world. The aircraft entered service with the British Overseas Airways Corporation in 1952, cutting the flight time from London to South Africa from 40 hours to just under 24. The age of jet air travel had dawned. But it would be some years before another jet airliner was produced. By now, an increasing number of nations were embracing the jet. In April 1946, 2 Russian jets made their maiden flight on the same day. One was the Yakovlev Yak-15, which was almost unique in being designed around a piston-engined airframe. This was that of the combat-proven Yak-3 fighter, in which the Russians installed a captured German UMO turbojet. The other jet to fly that day was the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-9. This was a totally Russian design and was remarkable in that it had taken just 14 months from initial inception to first flight. France too entered the jet age that same year, 1946, with the Sud-Ouest Triton, a remarkable achievement for a country which had recently suffered 4 years of enemy occupation. The Triton had been developed in a leaking hangar under the very noses of the German occupiers and made its first flight in November 1946. The United States, however, was determined to consolidate on the success of the P-80 Shooting Star and to take the lead in jet design. This resulted in some intriguing concepts, like the Ryan Fireball, which was fitted with a turbojet engine in the tail. But it also had a piston engine in the nose, the idea being that this would be used for cruising and that the pilot would switch to the higher speed jet engine for combat. The consolidated Vultee XP-81 used much the same principle, but neither of these 2 hybrids went into production, since their power output proved disappointing. More bizarre was the jet-powered Northrop XP-79, whose reinforced wings could be used to literally ram hostile aircraft. This crashed, however, on its maiden flight, bringing the project to an abrupt end. But 1946 saw 2 new conventional American military jets appear, both of which would perform sterling service. The first was the Republic F-84 Thunderjet, whose range of 1,200 miles meant that it could be used to penetrate and fight in enemy airspace. The other was the twin-engined McDonnell F-H-1 Phantom naval jet. while this saw only limited frontline service, its successor, the larger F-2H Banshee, would not be finally pensioned off until the mid-1960s. In March 1947, the world's first post-war jet bomber, the North American B-45 Tornado, made its maiden flight. The Tornado was one of the first jets to have afterburners installed. This entails burning additional fuel with the exhaust gases to provide increased thrust. Trials also took place using rocket-assisted takeoff to get the Tornado into the air more quickly. There was also a determined American assault on the airspeed record. On the 19th of June 1947, Colonel Albert M. Boyd of the U.S. Army Air Force raised the record by 8 miles per hour in a modified Lockheed Shooting Star. Two months later, it was the turn of the U.S. Navy, when Commander Turner E. Caldwell flew at 640 miles per hour in a Douglas Skystreak research aircraft. 5 days later, on the 25th of August 1947, Marine Corps Major Marion E. Carl flew at 650 miles per hour in the same aircraft. These successes were a welcome boost for the American aviation industry, but there was even greater excitement to come. During 1946 and 1947, the Bell Aircraft Corporation, in conjunction with the U.S. Air Force and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, had been developing a special aircraft. The Bell X-1, as it was called, had one prime purpose: to be the first aircraft to fly faster than sound. The X-1 was powered by 4 rocket motors and was attached to the belly of a B-29 bomber. This took the X-1 up to the required altitude. In a series of test flights, the plane came close to the speed of sound. Finally, on the 14th of October 1947, at Muroc Army Airfield, nowadays Edwards Air Force Base, on the western edge of California's Mojave Desert, the scene was set for an historic flight. Selected to be the first man to fly faster than sound was 24-year-old Air Force Captain Chuck Yeager. He'd flown P-51 Mustang fighters during the war and had downed 11 German aircraft. Indeed, he called his X-1 by the same name that he had used on his Mustang, Glamorous Glennis, in honor of his wife. But Yeager did not tell his bosses that he was suffering from 2 cracked ribs, the result of a fall from a horse 2 days earlier, for fear that they would stop him from flying. The Boeing B-29 duly took off, with Glamorous Glennis attached to it. Once the bomber had reached the planned altitude, Yeager lowered himself into the cockpit of the X-1 using an improvised lift. When Yeager was ready, the X-1 was released. He started the rocket motors. Soon he experienced the buffeting, to which he was now accustomed from previous near-sonic flights. He monitored the X-1's speed on a Mach meter, Mach 1 equating to the speed of sound at a particular altitude, and recalled, suddenly the Mach needle began to fluctuate. It went right up to 0.965 Mach, then tipped right off the scale. I thought I was seeing things. We were flying supersonic, and it was as smooth as a baby's bottom. Grandma could be sitting up there sipping lemonade. I kept the speed off the scale for about 20 seconds, then raised the nose to slow down. There was naturally great excitement when Jaeger landed after achieving this notable aviation first. Yet in later years, Jaeger was remarkably modest about his feat.
When I got the jump on the Mach meter, which was an indication that the shock wave had passed over the airplane, it really, I only had a feeling of accomplishment. That's about all, because it was a very hard program, and although I was not scared, I worried a little bit about the airplane, losing control of the airplane, because it had been predicted that we would probably either pitch up or pitch down. And once I got out to supersonic speeds, you have a feeling of relief, really.
But the newly independent US Air Force decided not to release the news immediately, and did not do so until June 1948, 8 months later. The reason was that they wanted to apply the X-1 experience to a new aircraft under development. This was a North American F-86 Sabre, the prototype of which had made its first flight 2 weeks before Chuck Yeager's historic flight. The Sabre was to become the first swept-wing fighter to enter production. It went into US Air Force service in 1948. The Sabre was also the first combat aircraft to go supersonic, albeit in a dive. Later versions of the Sabre were capable of flying supersonic in level flight. The F-86 also had a pressurized cockpit, which enabled the pilot to operate comfortably at higher altitudes than before. This led to renewed interest in the altitude record. But here too, the British initially led the way. In February 1948, John Cunningham, a renowned Second World War night fighter ace, flew a de Havilland Vampire to a height of almost 60,000 feet. Three and a half years later, American Bill Bridgman, flying a Douglas Skyrocket, raised the record to nearly 75,000 feet. Bridgman's aircraft was also released from a B-29. It was a novel experience to go where no human had before. As Bridgman came into land, he pondered,
"There seems to be no reflection. It's all black and white, apparent or non-apparent. It's a pure, immaculate world here."
It was the same sensation that the astronauts would begin to experience a decade later.
Who won the Masters, man?
By the 1950s, the jet was transforming aviation and demonstrating that the boundaries were seemingly limitless. It was beginning to enter civil aviation and was the backbone of major air forces. But for the military airmen at least, there was a major question which was haunting them. Had the speeds at which jet fighters could now fly compared to those of 1939-45 made air combat obsolete? It would not be long before they found out. In June 1950, a conflict erupted which would confirm whether or not the jet fighter pilot had a role to play in future air combat. The setting for this war was Korea, which, since World War II, had been divided into two countries. A surprise invasion by communist North Korea resulted in the speedy capture of Seoul, Western-backed South Korea's capital, and threatened to engulf the entire country. led by the Americans, United Nations forces were hastily deployed to South Korea. The United States had a number of air bases in Japan, which was still under Allied occupation. Its fighter aircraft included Second World War piston-engined P-51 Mustangs. There was also a variant of the Mustang, the F-82 Twin Mustang, an escort plane and the last piston-engined fighter to enter American service. More important were the jets, the Republic F-84 Thunderjet, which was deployed alongside the Shooting Star. Naval jets would also operate from carriers. This enabled them to attack targets deep in North Korea. Aircraft like the Grumman Panther rendered valuable service. However, towards the end of 1950, America's most modern fighter, the F-86 Sabre, was also deployed to Korea. The North Koreans, who had been wholly equipped by the Russians, initially had just piston-engine types, like the Ilyushin Il-10 ground attack aircraft. For the American jets, these now obsolete aircraft were easy meat. But in November 1950, a new aircraft appeared on the scene, the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-15, the latest combat jet in the Soviet armory, some of which the Russians had made over to North Korea. Now the question of the future of air combat could be resolved. On the 8th of November 1950, Lockheed F-80C Shooting Stars were on escort duty with B-29 bombers over North Korea. Suddenly, MiG-15s appeared. The Shooting Stars turned to meet them, but the MiGs used their superior speed to escape, except for one. Lieutenant Russell J. Brown dived on it and sent it crashing to the ground. But it was to be the battles between the equally matched MiGs and Sabres which came to dominate the air war in Korea. It was, however, the American pilots, rather than their aircraft, which proved decisive. Top aces like Captains Manuel Fernandez and Joe McConnell scored all their victories against MiGs and proved that air combat had not been made obsolete by the jet. Indeed, it's significant that almost all the American aces were World War II veterans. Yet they had no difficulty in adapting to the higher pace of jet combat. Their experience and that of their adversaries would serve to inspire aircraft designers to develop ever faster and more agile jets. The eventual result was to be today's high-performance combat aircraft.